So I don't really need to introduce Renee. She's been with us for several years, and we're really happy to see the product of her time here. And her talk will be Common Behaviors and Moral Codes, Modeling the Dynamics of Social Norms.
All right, thank you very much, Susan. All right, so for the past 6 years, I've been sitting on the other side of this room. And standing up here is pretty exciting. I have to say also somewhat intimidating, so please bear with me. But this is going to be a talk about social norms and on... Apologize. Just going to share my screen. Okay. Here we go. Yeah? Great. All right, so this is going to be a talk about social norms and on how we can use evolutionary theory to understand how norms change in a population or stay stable. And these past years, I've had two main theoretical interests. One is cultural evolution theory, which is a framework that aims to understand how culture changes over time and space, and understanding cultural change as somewhat analogous to Darwinian evolution. Then the other framework is sexual conflict theory, a theoretical perspective from evolutionary biology, which tries to understand how conflicts of interest between the sexes are played out over evolutionary time. Today, I'll be talking about two empirical studies that are part of my dissertation, with one study mainly being in the domain of cultural evolution theory, and another more in the sexual conflict theory part of this diagram. I also have a third, more theoretical paper that fits more nicely in the middle, and hopefully we can talk about it over coffee later today. One thing that I've really enjoyed in doing this work is finding the best way to statistically analyze complex problems. So today I'll also spend a little bit of time explaining some of my analyses as well. The first study that I'll talk about is based on fieldwork that I did in Namibia at the start of grad school. And it's about the social transmission of norms regarding perinatal care. Then I'll talk about another study that's about women's support for patriarchal gender norms in 4 East Asian countries. And then, depending on how I'm doing with time, I might give you a little sneak preview of something I've been working on more recently, where I've tried to apply the theory and the skills that I've learned throughout my graduate degree to an issue of economic gender inequality in the US. But before we dive in, I do think I need to lay some groundwork first, because I'm using this umbrella term of social norms to connect these two studies, but I think it's important to define some of these terms, because colloquially, when we talk about social norms, we can mean various things. So a social norm can refer to what most people in a population do. It can be descriptive in the sense that it describes common behaviors or conventions in a group. And the first part of the talk is more about descriptive norms. And I'm actually looking at the process through which a practice can become a convention. On the other hand, social norms can also be prescriptive. They can say something about what is morally considered right, and about what we think how the world ought to be, and how people should behave. So I argue that this distinction is important because, as I will discuss later on in this talk, I think that prescriptive norms might be subject to some different selective pressures and different processes of change. So I'm conveniently grouping these two cultural traits together under one umbrella term of social norms, but keep this distinction in the back of your mind throughout the talk. I'll start with this paper, which was the first study that I conducted at UCLA together with my advisor, Brooke. It was published in the Journal of Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. And it ended up winning a prize there for being the most impactful study published in that journal that year. So that was pretty cool. And this study is about the spread of a set of descriptive norms regarding perinatal care. The setting of the study was northwest Namibia, in an area where the Red Cross had a maternal and infant health program, where they encouraged women to follow a number of recommended behaviors in the perinatal period. So behaviors related to childbirth and infant care. And the questions that we were interested in were, how do norms introduced by a cultural outgroup spread in a population? And which factors lead to inter-individual variation in the uptake of new norms? So I think this question is theoretically interesting because it allows us to test several predictions from cultural evolution theory that had not often been tested in real-world settings like these. But I also think it's an important question from a public health perspective because some of the highest rates of maternal and infant mortality occur in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's important that we know what works in public health programs like these to improve these numbers. So we tested a set of predictions derived from cultural evolution theory and from findings from the public health literature to understand how behavioral practices as promoted by the Red Cross are adopted and shape women's preferences, plans, and practices. Cultural evolution theory is a broad theoretical framework that aims to understand the emergence and spread of cultural traits such as social norms. And at the core of this theory is the idea that culture consists of information that is learned and transmitted socially. And that that's under selective pressure because some of these traits are more likely to be passed on than others. And just like in biological evolution, cultural evolution is not unilinear and it doesn't go towards a certain goal or purpose. So many behaviors and beliefs that are crucial to thrive in a particular environment are best learned socially. It's easier and more efficient, for example, to learn how to take good care of your children by looking at what other people do rather than trying to find out all those things on your own. And here the hypothesis is that people have evolved a number of social learning strategies that act kind of like shortcuts or like rules of thumb to help select what's the best behavior to adopt in a situation where it's not actually immediately clear what is the most adaptive. And in our study, we investigated the potential norms of two of the more well-studied social learning strategies that are hypothesized in cultural evolution theory, also called social learning biases. The first one that we focused on is prestige bias social learning. So learners might attend to how successful or prestigious others around them seem and adopt the cultural traits from the most prestigious individuals in the hope that these traits were a contributing factor to the model's success. And there is some evidence that suggests that this is also important in the spread of social norms regarding reproduction. So for example, this study in Bangladesh showed that government programs aimed at promoting contraception were more successful when they were conducted in the homes of local opinion leaders rather than when health workers would visit homes individually. So having a prestigious in-group member who supports the use of contraceptives also increased the chances that other people also adopted this norm. So we thought of several ways through which prestige biased social learning can lead to out-group norm adoption. The first one being that if in-group members view members of the out-group as more prestigious, they might be more likely to adopt their cultural traits. And a second one being that when a few prestigious local actors first adopt an out-group norm, then their group members might follow them. And this is the version of prestige bias that we tested in our study. Then another learning bias that we looked at is conformity bias, which occurs when people preferentially copy the cultural trait that's most common in their group. And they choose this most common behavior at a rate that's higher than what we would expect when they would randomly pick an individual from the group to copy. So conformity bias can increase the spread of the norm after it's already been adopted by a significant part of the group, or it can also introduce a norm into a group when some group members interact with an outgroup. and when outgroup members become part of their reference group. So there are various ways in which interaction with a cultural outgroup and with outgroup assimilating individuals can lead to more outgroup norm adoption, including prestige bias, including conformity bias, social learning, but also when individuals that already hold more positive view of the outgroup and of outgroup norms are more likely to interact with this outgroup. And this is one of the topics that John Bunce, who was here last week, does a lot of work on. So generally, market participation is associated with assimilation to cultural outgroups. And there's also quite some research on birth practices showing that positive interaction with outgroups and their norms, for example, through education, matter in norm adoption. Then lastly, we also know that there are a number of situational factors that can act as barriers or facilitators of things like hospital birth and contraceptive use. So think about things like having the money and the transportation to be able to reach medical facilities. So in this study, we examined how social learning biases and situational factors affect the uptake of newly introduced perinatal care norms. And we looked at norm adoption at 3 levels. We looked at women's preferences or their beliefs about which norms are best, women's plans for what they are planning to do for their next birth, and practices for what women did during their previous birth. We conducted this study in Northwest Namibia among several communities of people who call themselves Himba. So I think most of you guys are very familiar with Himba because of Brooke's research. So I won't say too much here, but most Himba are agro-pastoralists, meaning that they tend to cows and other livestock and tend to gardens. And until quite recently, many Himba lived in relative isolation from mainstream markets, but today people are becoming increasingly market integrated and also have much better access to healthcare services. So traditionally, Himba women practice some culturally specific norms related to childbirth and infant care. For example, colostrum disposal and feeding newborns with cow or goat milk, as well as the use of butters and herbs to keep infants clean. And I'll mention a couple of other things later. Maternal kin and other community members usually act as midwives, but there also has been an increase in maternal health care programs in the region. So since 2013, there have been multiple healthcare programs in the region, specifically targeted at improving maternal and child health. So most importantly, there's been a Red Cross program that promoted several health recommendations for women. And government-employed nurses visit compounds monthly and provide things like contraception and also provide information about recommended health behaviors. So this is a map of the study site. Our sample included Himba communities close to this town, Upuo. Oh, you can't see my mouse. But where the red circle is, there's a hospital there and a maternal health clinic. And then we also collected samples from a rural area about, I have here 120 kilometers, I don't know what that is in miles, north of Upuo, where there is a small field clinic and also a nurse that visits these compounds. So to understand how these newly introduced health behaviors spread among women, we tested predictions of conformity bias social learning. So women are more likely to adopt the norms they think most others in their group already support. Prestige bias. Women who aspire to be more like outgroup assimilating others are more likely to adopt outgroup norms, it was our prediction. And then we also tested some predictions on interaction with the outgroup and access to resources. And we looked at how well each of these predictions explained women's preferences, plans, and practices regarding perinatal care. Our fieldwork was conducted in the summer of 2018. And first we held focus groups with Himba women and interviews with health workers to learn more about the local norms and more about these healthcare programs that had been active in the region. And then we interviewed 100 women who had given birth within the last 2 years. The interviews had 3 main parts. We asked women about some demographic data. Then we asked them questions related to our key predictors that I just showed you, and some questions about their perinatal care preferences, plans, and practices. So we addressed our main predictions by first asking women which norms they think most other Himba women prefer. So for example, do you think most other Himba women prefer to give birth at home or at the hospital as our measure for conformity bias? Then as our measure for prestige bias, we asked women to imagine two women, one Himba woman who lives a traditional lifestyle and who is more, who lives a traditional lifestyle, and she lives in a compound where her family takes care of cows and goats, and she wears traditional clothes. And we asked women to compare this woman with someone who is more out-group assimilating, so somebody who wears like Western clothing and works for pay, for example. And then we asked women to tell us which of these 2 individuals they would rather be like themselves, and which of these 2 individuals would they like their own daughters to be like. Then we also took some measures of interaction with out-group and with out-group assimilating individuals, and several measures of wealth. So these are some of the norm domains that we addressed. They were chosen based on these focus groups and on the unstructured interviews that we did. And as an outcome measure, we asked women about their preferences, plans, and practices for each of these norm domains. So for example, for the first one, the questions were, do you think it's better to give birth at home or at the hospital? For your next birth, are you planning to give birth at home or at the hospital? And for your most recent birth, did you give birth at home or at the hospital? And some of the other norm domains were delayed versus immediate breastfeeding, steam baths to stop the mother's postpartum bleeding, which is a traditional practice. And we also looked at several hygiene practices, for example, and I can answer questions about these other norms later as well. So women's answers to these questions were used as outcome variables in logistic regression models. So we use Bayesian multi-level regression models. I ran separate models for each of these outcome variables, preferences, plans, and practices, and per outcome variable for each of the 4 predictions. So that's 12 models in total. And then I modeled how our predictors affect the probability for women to adopt the outgroup norm. So this is a binary outcome for in-group versus out-group norms adopted. So this follows the Bernoulli distribution. And each of our models consists of a linear regression model with the logit link function, an intercept that I'm allowing to vary between respondents, between norms, and between compounds. And then the regressions included 1 or sometimes several parameters for the predictors of interest. So in this case, this is the model for conformity-biased social learning. And I also included a few other variables in each model: women's age-corrected parity, so how many children they've had, and whether their mother is alive or not, because we thought that these things might also affect women's plans and practices, but are outside of our interest for this study. So then I compared the models with the same outcome variables based on their ability to make accurate predictions when presented with new data. And for this, I used this method called leave one out cross-validation. So what that method does is you run an algorithm that divides the data up into a training set and a testing part. And you train the model on one part and then score its performance on the other part. And you repeat this throughout your whole data set. So computationally, this is very heavy because you basically have to rerun the model, in my case, 100 times. So it takes a really long time, but there are some algorithms that allow us to take some mathematical shortcuts that make it much more doable for the average machine to do this. And this method, the leave one out cross-validation, yields more robust results when using smaller sample sizes like the one in our study. So what this method eventually does, it computes a distribution of estimated performance scores. And here, lower scores are better because lower scores signify fewer distance between the predicted values and the actually observed values. The algorithm also assigns a weight to each model, which signifies the probability that that model is the best. All right. I'll show you the results in a second. So I'm first going to show you these distributions of estimated performance scores for each of the models, for each outcome. So first, we're looking at preferences. And the lines here represent the distributions of estimated performance scores. The green points are the means of the distribution. And remember that lower scores are better. So it's immediately clear here that the conformity model performed the best in predicting women's preferences compared to our models for perceived bias, interaction frequency, and access to resources. As you can see, it's also given 99% of the model weight. And this is also the case for women's plans and their preferences, and their practices, sorry. So in each of these cases, our conformity biased models were the best in predicting new data compared to the models for perceived bias, interaction frequency, and availability of resources. So I want to take some time to look more closely at these conformity models. Here you can see the posterior distributions of the effect sizes of the conformity models for preferences, plans, and practices. And when you look at the effect of conformity, so over here, you can see that almost all of the distribution falls right of zero. More than 99% for the model of preferences. Also more than 99% of distribution falls right of zero for plans, and for practices it was about 89%. So women who believe that most other HIMA women have adopted the new medical recommendation are more likely to prefer, plan, and to practice these recommendations themselves. All right. But to understand the magnitude of this effect in more absolute terms, I think it's important to look at some counterfactual predictions, because then we can see what the effect of believing most other supported medical recommendation is on women's preferences, plans, and practices, when also taking into account the other variables as well. So as an example, imagine this hypothetical woman. She lives far from the provincial capital and is average in terms of her age and the number of kids. So I think we modeled her to be 26 and have 3 kids. So for a woman like her, if she thinks that most other HIMA women prefer the in-group norm, for example, giving birth at home, then there's about a 28% chance that she herself will prefer to give birth at the hospital, which is the out-group norm in this case. However, if the same woman thinks that other women prefer hospital birth, then her chance of preferring the out-group norm as well increases to 75%. So that's quite a big difference, actually. And here you can see the absolute effects of this conformity variable on preferences, plans, and practices, but now averaged over all the norms that we looked at. So you can see that there's a substantial change in each of these when women believe others prefer the traditional norm versus the medical recommendation. And I also looked at the absolute effects of the main predictors of the other models, which I can show you later if there are questions about it. But all of them were much smaller, and some of them even around 0. I can show them later, though. So there seems to be quite a strong association between what women believe is the majority norm and their own preferences. And this is in line with our predictions of conformity-biased social learning. However, it's important to note that it's not conclusive evidence. To be able to really conclusively show that, we would have to show that women are disproportionately likely to adopt the common norm, and that this is really what's driving the norm change. So it's really hard to do that with observational data. But what we can do with the data that we have is look at the different frequencies between previous practices and current preferences for each norm. So that's what I'm showing you here. Here we subtracted the posterior predictions of women's previous practices from their current preferences to see how each differs per norm. And in this figure, positive values indicate norm domains in which the Himba tradition was more often practiced at women's previous birth, but now the medical recommendation is more often preferred. And negative values indicate the opposite. Values around 0 indicate no change. And this means that random copying alone could produce similar results. So in two cases, we actually see a shift away from traditional practices towards a preference for the medical recommendation at a level that exceeds what would be expected under this random copying that in theory could occur. So that's for birth location and birth control. So 77% of women report having ever used contraceptives, whereas 91% prefer to do so now or in the future. And then we also saw a big shift from about half of the women who have given birth at the hospital before towards 85% who prefer to do so now. So this could mark a true shift in preferences that is the result of conformity bias, as the differences between the previous practices and current preferences are larger than what would be expected under random copying alone, and also, importantly, because we find this strong effect of women's perceptions of the majority preference. So to conclude, overall, we find strong evidence of a change in norms related to perinatal care. Within 5 years of the first outreach programs, a majority of the women have adopted some of these important medical recommendations. And women are more likely to adopt the medical recommendation when they think that the majority of their peers have already shifted, suggesting that social learning is really a driver of norm change. And for 2 of the norms that we looked at, this shift in preferences was also consistent with predictions from conformity-biased social learning. But it is important to note that our study design did not allow us to test whether the likelihood of copying a norm was proportionate to its frequency, and we'd have to show this to really be more conclusive. We also show that in this case, the promotion of new norms did not lead to the erosion of other traditional practices. So women in our study continue to practice recommendations that were not in conflict with the Red Cross medical recommendations. Also, what we did not expect was that monetary or logistical barriers did not explain variation in norm adoption in our study. And also perceptions of prestige in the way that we operationalized it, at least, did not seem to play a role at the time of our study. Although it might have played a role earlier on in the process of norm adoption, or could be present in a different form as well. So our study, I think, shows that norm change interventions could be more successful if once a new norm has already been adopted by a majority of the population, this is also clearly communicated to the public. And this is also what some other work on norm change interventions shows. And I actually saw some of this during the COVID pandemic. When I was in the Netherlands, I would see these signs on the side of the road that would say, like, 60% of the people in this town have already gotten their shot. Now it's your turn, or something like that. So I think that's a cool example of like how you can put this type of results into practice. All right, how am I on time? Great. I'll now move on to the next study. which is about women's interest in and support for patriarchal gender norms. So in this study, I used the other theoretical framework, sexual conflict theory, to try to understand why some women support norms that seem, at least from my perspective or the perspective of like Western feminism, to be against their own self-interest. When I talk about gender norms, I'm talking about prescriptive norms on what is considered appropriate or morally good behavior based on people's gender. And patriarchal gender norms are norms that justify men's dominance over women, give men more rights than women, or that otherwise favor men over women. So in this study, I'm interested in whether we can detect factors beyond the social transmission of values, so beyond the effect of things like education, of religion, or political affiliation that are also known to shape people's attitudes. The paper that has most heavily influenced my thinking on this is written by Barbara Smuts. It's called The Evolutionary Origins of the Patriarchy. And this is really my favorite work in anthropology. I think it's probably the best paper that I've read throughout the past 6 years that I've been here, so I can recommend it to everyone. Please read it. I can't fully do it justice here, but in short, Smuts argued that throughout the evolution of our species, differences in male and female reproductive biologies have led to a stronger interest of males to control female sexuality than vice versa. And sexual coercion by males is present in other mammals and other primate species as well, but Smuts points at certain unique aspects of human ecology and biology that have allowed human males to exert greater control over females than occurs in other species. And one of these aspects is through the cultural evolution of social norms that justify men's dominance over women, which is made possible by our evolved ability to communicate through language. So understanding patriarchal norms as a product of sexual conflict can help us understand why these norms have evolved. And when I say that, I explicitly mean culturally evolved. So I'm not talking about any like genetic adaptation, for example. And understanding patriarchal norms as a product of sexual conflict can also help us understand why people might care so deeply about how others should behave and might even try to police the behavior of others. I also think that this perspective allows us to make some predictions about other socio-ecological factors besides gender that should influence people's interest in gender norms. So, for example, Brooks and Blake have suggested that the gender composition of people's relatives should play a big role in gendered fitness interests, and that having sons and other male relatives should make women more invested in patriarchal norms, if they can gain inclusive fitness benefits from doing so. On the other hand, though, not all gender norms are necessarily thought to reflect purely a conflict of interest between women and men. So particularly norms related to gender roles could in fact benefit reproductive units as a whole. So following a preset gender division of labor might allow heterosexual couples to more efficiently divide the tasks that are needed to run a household. And importantly, this hypothesis does not imply that women and men always benefit equally from these types of norms. But it does suggest that both women and men are better off following these preset gender norms than they would be without cooperating at all. So gender is one of the most discussed topics in anthropology, and I talk about more different views in the paper. But I think these are the most important evolutionary perspectives on gender norms on which I've based my predictions for this study. So these are my hypotheses on what predicts people's interest in and also their support for patriarchal gender norms. The first, gender. The hypothesis is that women are less supportive of patriarchal norms than men. I also hypothesize that women's age is negatively correlated with support for egalitarian norms, and that this effect is stronger in women than in men. So this prediction follows ethnographic observations of East Asian patriarchy, as well as from the fact that the older you get, the less of your reproductive career is still ahead of you, so the less reproductive cost women may occur from patriarchal norms. So the data that I'm using to test these hypotheses is cross-sectional. So we should expect a correlation between age and patriarchal norms anyway as a result of generational changes in attitudes. So the thing to focus on here really is this predicted gender difference in the age effect. Then the next prediction is about having sons. So having sons versus daughters is associated with patriarchal norms. And this effect, according to the gendered fitness hypothesis, should become smaller with age as more relatives from different genders arrive and the gendered fitness interests balance out over time. That's what the prediction from Brooks and Blake is. Then lastly, I also predict that women in marital relationships are more supportive of patriarchal norms. So as I mentioned just before, married couples could have a stronger interest in gender roles if they can enjoy some of these efficiency benefits of a sexual division of labor. But also, sexual conflict theory predicts that the fitness interests of partners should overlap more if a relationship is more stable and more monogamous. I also had a last prediction on social status. I might say something briefly about this at the end, but I want to focus on these other predictions for this talk. So I had originally intended to do a version of this study in person in China and Taiwan in a combination with ethnographic research, but I wasn't able to travel there because of the pandemic. So instead, I ended up testing these hypotheses on survey data from 4 East Asian populations. And the main variable of interest in these data set is people's answers to questionnaire items about gender norms. So here I'm showing you a couple of examples of these questions. So for example, a husband's job is to earn money, a wife's job is to look after the home. And as you can see, most of these norms are about the gender division of labor. There's also a few others, for example, about the father's authority in the household and the importance of having sons. So these norm items are measured on a Likert scale. So people are asked, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statements? Then they see the statements, and then they can fill out whether they completely disagree, disagree a little, agree a little, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very often how attitudes are measured in social scientific research, but using this data and interpreting it in statistical models is actually not so straightforward. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about how I solved that issue. Because we give people these categories that help us quantify information about their attitudes. But of course, we don't assume that people actually think in categories. We might assume that attitudes are more like a continuous variable, and that people can range from having very patriarchal views to very egalitarian norms and anywhere in between, even if what we measure is these categorical variables. So we can try to model this relationship between people's continuous real attitudes and their stated answers on a Likert scale. If we assume that the people's real attitudes are somewhat are normally distributed, and by assuming that there are these cutoff points, as you see here, or thresholds at which anyone whose attitudes are more patriarchal choose a lower score, and whose attitudes are more egalitarian choose a higher score. So in this depiction, for example, there are 4 answer categories that are divided by 4-1 thresholds. Then, to calculate the probability that somebody chooses answer category K, we calculate the cumulative distribution up until threshold K minus the distribution up until K minus 1. And that's what's shown here in this equation that you can see here. And we can link this equation to a more simple linear regression, like the one that I'm showing you here, which shows the model for testing gender and age effects. So in all models, I'm also including variables for education, for whether people live in an urban or rural area, as well as a measure for how traditional people's attitudes are generally, not to things that are related to gender. So I'm doing this because, of course, people's attitudes towards gender are also very much a product of social influence and social learning. But here, for this study, I really wanted to focus on the potential fitness interests and how they might affect people's interests in gender norms and also their attitudes. So that's why I'm stratifying the sample by these confounders. All right. Up to the results. So first, I tested the effects of gender and age in a model where both women and men's attitudes are included. So this shows you the posterior distributions of all population level predictors in that model, averaged over all individuals and averaged over all norms. In all the slides that I'm going to show you that kind of look like this, negative estimates mean that a predictor is associated with more patriarchal norms, and positive estimates mean that they're linked to more egalitarian norms. And what you should notice first when you look at this is that these bottom two effects, traditionalism and education, are the largest. And that also follows my expectations that these things related to social influence are really important. And that's also what consistently comes out of all my models. But let's zoom in on this gender and age interaction. So the gender-age interaction is mostly in expected direction, except for in Japan, meaning that in the other countries, for women, age is more strongly associated with patriarchal norms than for men. So this follows my expectation, at least for these three countries. And just like in the last study, I also want to show you the absolute effects, since it's pretty hard to interpret the magnitude of these effects just based on their effect sizes alone. So in the next slide, I'll show you some counterfactual predictions again. So what happens if you hold all variables constant, but vary only age and gender? But keep in mind what this cumulative probit model that I just showed you on a couple slides back, keep in mind what the model does. It calculates the probability that people choose a particular answer category in the Likert scale, depending on the predictor variables that I put in the model. So it can show you how these probabilities change when we hold everything constant, but only vary gender and age. And it looks something like this. This is pretty complex. The gray columns show the effect of age on gender norms for men. In color, it shows the same, but for women. And the bottom rows refer to the most egalitarian answer options, and the top rows for the most patriarchal options. So what you're trying to see here is the difference in slope between men and women. But because these effects are so small, this is actually really difficult to see. So what I'm going to show you instead is a plot that summarizes this data in a way that I think is more easily interpretable. So here again, colored bands are for women, gray is for men, and here the differences in slopes is easier to see. Although again, they're very small differences. In Japan, we don't see a difference at all. In China and Taiwan, it's maybe a little bit bigger. In South Korea, you have to look really carefully. So in those three countries, for women, age is more strongly correlated with patriarchal norms than for men, although like very slightly so. All right. Then I also ran a second model that's testing predictions on women's preferences specifically. First, let's look at the effect of having sons. So the expectation here was that having sons should be associated with more patriarchal norms. And you see that these effects are actually pretty mixed. Only in China and South Korea are they in the expected direction. So because this was not what I expected, I thought it would be helpful to look at the varying effects of different norms to see what's going on. And that's what you see here. And the thing that I would like you to focus on is, so these are the posterior distributions of all the different norms separately for this effect of sons. And the one that immediately pops out is norm number 7, where the whole distribution is more negative than for the other values. So norm number 7 is to continue the family line, one must have at least one son. Okay, so a preference for sons is associated with having more sons, right? But for the other norms, you see that the effect is much smaller or even non-existent. And when we remove this norm from the model, the effect almost completely disappears. So that's not very encouraging. But the other prediction from this gendered fitness interests hypothesis was that the effect of children's gender should become smaller with age. So let's see what that looks like. And the prediction here was, the effect of children's gender would become smaller over time because of the arrival of other relatives of like all different genders. But the findings are actually not in the expected direction, and if anything, they are actually opposite from what would be expected. So it seems like the gendered fitness interest hypothesis is not really supported in our study, and it seems like any association with having sons is more likely the result of reverse causality rather than fitness interest. So then lastly, let's look at marital status. The prediction here was that married women had more patriarchal norms, and this is also what is supported by the data in all countries. And remember that these models account for women's age and also for how traditional people's values are in general. But even when considering those factors, women who are married have more patriarchal views than those who are not. All right, so I'll summarize this study as well. So doing this study with 4 data sets practically means replicating your own work 4 times, which I really do not recommend anyone to do. But I do think that I can carefully conclude some things about my sexual conflict predictions on people's interests in gender norms, and whether these are reflected in their stated attitudes. So in this study, like many others, I find that women's support for patriarchal norms is quite a bit lower than men's. But I also found that there's a lot of variation among women. And our predictions on age and the relationship between age and norms follows what we find in most countries. So women become more patriarchal with age at a rate that's faster than men's. And I do think it's important to note that longitudinal research would be better able in answering this question, because there are still other possibilities that could produce the same data at this point. But I do think that this gender difference that we found can give us some confidence that even in a cross-sectional data set like this, the effect that we find is not caused by generational changes in attitudes alone. Then we also find that married women have higher support for patriarchal norms after taking into account their age. So this could mean that following preset gender norms actually is advantageous or not costly when you're in a stable heterosexual relationship. Or it could also result from more overlapping fitness interests of partners who are in long-term relationships. That's what shows here. So all these effects are pretty small and much smaller, for example, than the effect of education, but they are detectable in large samples like these. Then lastly, one interesting finding here, I think, is the predicted son effect. So the association between sons and norms that we predicted only came up in China and South Korea and seemed to be largely driven by this one norm that's about son preference. And it seems to me more likely that the causal arrow here goes in the opposite direction. So people with more patriarchal norms have more sons rather than vice versa. And the fact that this is not observed in the other countries, I think further supports this idea, because China and South Korea have had particularly skewed child sex ratios over the last 40 years or longer. All right, so what I've tried to do in this talk is show you 2 ways in which I think we can use evolutionary theory to inform our understanding on how social norms are distributed in a population and might change over time. But then I think we do have a couple minutes, so I want to give you a sneak preview of things that I've been working on more recently. So one project that I've been working on is trying to model the effect of having children on parental income in the US. For this study, I'm using data from the panel survey on income dynamics, which is a very large cohort study in the US. And here you can see how I've modeled the effect of having children on moms and dads' incomes, holding constant age effects, and also market effects, so things like inflation or recessions. And this is data from the past 20 years. And you see this huge dip in income actually starts happening right before childbirth, and the dip is much larger for women than for men. So now what I'm working on is to see what predicts how big this gender gap is. For example, how much do parental leave policies matter? So this plot is comparing parents who are eligible for paid leave to bond with a child versus those who weren't at the time that their first child was born. And I'm also interested in looking how much do people's social norms and their ideas about what gender roles should be matter for this child penalty. And this has been a really fun project because I learned a lot of new techniques. I mean, I used a lot of the skills that I've learned here in grad school, but I've tried to integrate my knowledge on statistics and my knowledge on like reproduction and sexual conflict with all these new methods from policy research. And I'm trying to figure out how to do all these methods that are very common in policy research in a Bayesian way. So that's been a really cool challenge. And I'd also love to talk about that more, maybe over coffee later. But this was it for today. Thank you all so much. First of all, I have to thank my academic committee and all the other people who have helped me in the past years, which is a lot of people who are here today. So thank you guys so much. Also, thanks to everyone who zoomed in. I think I saw Tina and Katie and my whole family. So anyway. I think anyone who knows me knows that I cry a lot. So okay, yeah, time for questions.
You can handle the questions if you have to do.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe first, let's see if there's anyone in the room. Delaney.
Amazing talk. I really enjoyed it and so easy to follow, so thank you for that. I was curious about in your study one with traditional norms changing, and there was a couple that seemed to go the other way that were almost like becoming more traditional. I was wondering if there was anything significant there.
Yeah.
What those traits were, because I didn't recognize the words.
Okay, let's see if I can actually make this screen share happen again. Is it happening?
Could you repeat the question for us?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question as well. Sorry, just a second. Okay. So the question was like, what's happening with these norms where the shift actually seems to be going in the opposite direction? So from like the new recommendations to the traditional norms. And you can see that happening with like these three here. So I'll explain what they are first, and then I'll answer your question. So ojibumba is this mix of butter and herbs that women put on their child as kind of a hygiene practice rather than using water to clean their babies. And the medical recommendation here is like health workers are telling people that they should wash their children with water, which also happens if you give birth at a hospital, then they do that for you. But some Himba women have told me that they believe that this is more likely to make the child sick. And I think this traditional practice is also related to the fact that they live in a very arid region and there's not that much access to water all the time. The next one is a traditional necklace that women wear around the period of their birth. And this is something that's not really in conflict with any medical recommendation. So there are some women who told us that they didn't do this in the past for their previous birth because there are certain external factors that influence whether women are able to wear the necklace. So for example, I think their father has to sacrifice a goat for them to be able to have the ceremony in which they start wearing the necklace. But sometimes, the father isn't around or wasn't able to buy a goat to slaughter or something like that. So that can influence whether women practice this norm or not. But again, this is not really in conflict with medical recommendations. So most women are hoping that they can do that for their next birth. And then the Mopane practice is when women, after they give birth, sometimes they kind of make a steam bath for themselves in the ground where they put these specific leaves on a fire, and then steam comes out, and then women kind of sit over it, and that should help against postpartum bleeding. And this is also a practice I think that medical workers not really say that much about. It's of course not practiced in the hospital, but I think there are no recommendations against using this necessarily. Brooke is adding that the leaves are antiseptic. Thanks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Cool. Thank you. Clark.
Thanks. What a great presentation. I really appreciate your seconding what the lady said, the clarity of presenting these very, very complicated statistical models is really great. I also really appreciate the use of this kind of theory and statistics to address these contemporary issues that are really important, like gender norms. So thank you so much for that. I guess I wanted to ask, I know we've talked many times about the theoretical framing of this, but it seems like these theories, and you're following tradition in cultural evolution theory, which is that individuals have a choice about what norms to adopt, or that individuals do choose which norms to adopt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which seems like a reasonable possibility, although obviously that's not the only one, right? And so I was wondering, I was particularly struck by one of the really strong findings you had in the second study, which was that married women are more endorse patriarchal norms. I didn't quite follow the several options that you gave, but it seemed like you gave several having to do with why they might choose this given that they're married, or why they might endorse these given that they're married. And then it seems like another possibility is that women who endorse patriarchal norms in those cultures are the ones that are more likely to get married for a variety of reasons. I wasn't sure if that was in your analysis, but I guess I wanted to ask that and then zoom out to the bigger question of, can you use these kinds of analyses and data to actually interrogate that assumption of cultural evolution theory, and to ask things like, how often do people really choose their norms based on their own individual interests versus some other kind of model of norm adoption that involves more structural factors about, something like it's not an individual choice, but you adopt the norms that you grew up with, and then you see those patterns in things like these demographic data about correlations between norm endorsement and things like marriage and age. So I don't know if you have.
Okay, great.
That's a hard question.
I'm gonna try to still remember your second question after I answered the first. So the first question was about this effect. It was about the second study in which I showed that there's a relationship between being married and endorsing more patriarchal norms. And I think the main point of your question was, well, maybe the causality could be reversed, right? People might just marry because they have these more traditional norms. And I think that's a fair assumption, or that's a fair suggestion. When I tested this effect, I didn't actually think it was gonna come up as being in line with my predictions, because I thought in countries like, especially China, but also to a lesser extent Taiwan and South Korea, most women end up marrying at some point in their life. So I was like, well, if you're forward looking and you think that you're going to be married at some point too, then like your actual marital status shouldn't really affect whether you have an interest in these norms. So I was pretty skeptical, but we didn't end up finding this. I do think it could definitely be true that the causality is reversed, although given that in China the rate of marriage, especially among women, is so high, it's like 98% or something like that. That I think is maybe some evidence in suggestion that like maybe it's not that just women who are more patriarchal in their norms end up marrying, because everyone actually ends up marrying. But
or if there's a small number who don't end up marrying, maybe that's because those are the unusual people who actively resist the patriarchal norms and don't get married.
yes. So, no, I mean, and you're absolutely right. I kind of thought that group is so small that I wouldn't expect it to produce an effect of this size. But I mean, I definitely recognize that this is a possibility as well. And then your other question was about whether people actually choose, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, whether people really choose what their norms are rather than like there being other mechanisms. Or, can you?
Yes, but also, is there? Do you now that you've done these studies and you seem to, and like the last one you presented seems really cool. I'm wondering, like now that you have more familiarity with a variety of methods for testing these things, do you think you could use those as a kind of meta way to ask whether these assumptions of cultural evolution theory and social learning theory, how good they are at explaining, you know, the spread of beliefs, because they seem to make some very specific assumptions, and in my perception of the field, they're often taken as the only options on the table.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of course, going to see evidence for conformity bias, things like that. If you look for it, there's no question that those things exist. The question is, like, could you use statistical methods to say how much of the spread of beliefs is actually explained by those kinds of mechanisms?
Explained by.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's like something I've kind of tried to do in the second study, right, where I'm like, well, I'm not really testing like these specific social learning biases, but I am like kind of trying to show the difference in effects between like social things that I think are the result of social learning versus like people's interests. I mean, I do think that it's with observational data really difficult to really find out what the mechanisms are. You see that in the first study, I tried to, like I set out to show whether conformity by social learning happens in this population, but I think in that case, it's not possible to really do this with observational data. So we really tried to approximate it as best as we could, but I think in the end we weren't able to show that. And in the second study, I think we were maybe better able to like differentiate between those two. But one thing that I really was from the start interested in looking at in this data, but also like when I was planning to do it originally in the field, was to see whether people actually like endorse these norms or whether they are they're only making certain statements because that's what the majority norm is, and it's better not to deviate from what the majority of the population says. And that's really what I was interested in doing, and why I like tested some of these predictions on like social class, for example, and their effect on what people which norms people endorse, at least like when they are doing a survey like this. I did end up finding that social status for women was more strongly associated with egalitarian norms for women than for men, and was like what one of my expectations was. But it was really difficult in this data because the variables that I had on like social status, they weren't actually that good and wasn't really clear what they were measuring. So I ended up like, I think that's not like the best part of this study. So that's why I didn't really talk about it today. But I think if you had better measures for things like that, then you might be able to like, I do have some hope that that's something you could detect with data like these.
Great. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Erica.
Hi. Thanks so much. Really, I mean, just beautiful work. And like, the graphs are almost as beautiful as the work is. So also, I feel bad that you repeat the questions for the people online, but not the compliments. So you should just tell them you're getting a lot of compliments.
Okay, Erica is telling everyone on Zoom that I'm also getting compliments.
Yeah. Just so they think it's not just like all hard hitting questions. I was wondering about if you could talk a little bit more about the this is moving, about the interaction effect between age and like age and I don't know, womanhood. Like that like women are changing faster in their
Yes.
in their like adherence to patriarchal norms than men are, and I thought that was really interesting. And I was just wondering, I don't know if since it's not longitudinal data, but I mean but you have like huge numbers cross sectionally. I was wondering, like, do you have any sense? Is it like they're staying egalitarian longer and then they're switching at some point, and so the like slope is higher, or do you think there's some like event where like when women get married they change, or when they have children they change, or like I'm just wondering if you could dive a little bit into like what your thoughts are about why that you might get this interaction effect for women.
Okay, that's a really good question. So Erica gave many compliments, and then she asked about to give some more detail about this gender age effect, and kind of talking a little bit more about like maybe how that process would take place, or like where in the lifespan women start shifting their norms and things like that.
If you have any idea about what's driving it, or like any hypotheses.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, first of all, I think I should say that these plots are probably a little bit misleading because they show a linear effect, but that's because I kind of like summarized this, like this slide. And I think if this effect is produced by what I was predicting, that like women's interests change over time because less of their reproductive career is ahead of them as they get older. So the reproductive cost of patriarchal norms also become less over time. Then I think you would expect that this relationship goes pretty smoothly until like menopause, where it should kind of stave off. But that's not something that I really looked at in detail in this study. The marital thing, I think, is another thing that, like, I mean, there's also these other expectations that I showed you on why I think there's a effect of being married. I think that's all I got. Sorry, I'm not sure if that's
a really interesting finding that stood out to me, and I was just wondering if you had any, insights into like why you might get a stronger change with age for women than men.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, what I predicted is that it's because of this like reduction over time of the cost that women could incur from patriarchal norms. There's also some ethnographic literature that's like also making this observation that women, as they get older, seem to be more approving of these patriarchal norms. And I mean, I guess that's also kind of interesting to talk about because there's some work by, I think her first name is also Erica Wolf. Anyone correct me if I'm wrong. But she has done work in Taiwan, and another scholar called Kondioti who has some ethnographic work on China. So both of them are saying that like women become more patriarchal with age because they also kind of start enjoying the benefits more. Like they like are in these like sometimes intergenerational households where they came in when they're young, they're marrying this guy and then they marry into his family, and they're basically treated as like servants of the whole family when they're young. Then as they get older, they kind of like settle down in the family. They establish their relationship with their patrilineal family members or the affins, and so in that way they also incur less cost of like what happened initially when they joined these families versus when they're like older and maybe they also have more sons, so they enjoy more status because of that. So that's, I guess, some more ethnographic description of what could happen. Okay, it's kind of hard for me to. Yes. Hi, Molly.
I think they're really fascinating and attractive visually experienced talk. I was really interested in, what you're talking about, and that I was so curious about connecting the first and second papers that you presented. I was curious if you had any thoughts about any of the I forget what you call it, the more like medicalized reproductive preferences or choices or options themselves being patriarchal cultural norms as opposed to being some sort of like inherently better or healthier choices, and whether to any extent you perceived or expect to perceive women's preferences or decision making to be influenced by the same, I guess, processes or biases involved in other, I guess, patriarchal normative things that are being transmitted, through these other parts of life. Because, I mean, my sort of gut perception is, and I'm less of an expert than you, is that some of these reproductive medical practices are, excuse me, at least partially influenced by the patriarchal history of Western medicine.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Let me take a moment to see how I'm going to answer that. So, I mean, the specific norms that we looked at, we, I guess, assumed from the outset of our study that they would be beneficial for women to follow. Like these health recommendations would be beneficial for women to follow. They're all WHO recommended norms on about the perinatal period. So we didn't really, I guess, question that in our study. But I see the interesting point that you're making about like maybe for people who don't know that much about Himba. So Himba have a matrilineal descent system, and relative to other populations in sub-Saharan Africa that have patrilineal descent systems, Himba women have relatively high sexual autonomy, for example, and autonomy in other regions as well. So you're like posing the idea of these like medical recommendations coming more out of the framework of like a history of colonialism and contact with maybe patriarchal populations. I mean, I think like generally a distrust for medical intervention or medical services from outsiders is present in a lot of populations like these. And I think, I mean, Brooke, maybe you looked at this also more recently, I think, with the COVID vaccines and like hesitance to accept medical treatments provided by outsiders. I do think that women in our population, some of them were pretty skeptical of going to the hospital where they, for example, are not able to give birth in the presence of their own mothers or other female relatives, and things like that. And I definitely think that hesitancy is related to like, a history of being exposed to things brought in by outsiders which end up being, well, pretty bad for you and like bad experiences with medical care. In our study we tried to also look at like how much people's previous experiences with the medical system, how much they would influence whether people adopted these new norms. That ended up being really difficult to study because, well, we tried to get women to sort of like rate on a scale from 1 to 10, like how happy they were with like previous experience in a hospital. That ended up not being a really good method for this particular setting. So that's something we didn't really look at quantitatively. But I do think that like a general hesitancy of accepting medical care from outsiders for good reasons maybe has been present in this population. Long-winded answer that maybe partly answers your question. I also see there's a question from Dan.
Hi, Renee. So we were able to hear the compliments in the room, and they're richly deserved. It's really nice work and very well presented. So congratulations.
Thank you, Dan.
So I want to follow up on this marriage effect again. I endorse the reverse causality possibility, and certainly in East Asia, the Erica Wolf effect, if you will, right? That is the incentives of embracing a position that gives one power in the family is, I think that's a very powerful possibility as an explanation. But that doesn't explain younger women, right? So if you were to partition the sample, not everyone marries at exactly the same age. So if you were to partition the sample to women about the average age of marriage, and then look at those who have married and those who haven't, that's going to take out any of those kinds of, ascending the hierarchy dynamics. It's possible that you'll still find an effect in marriage. And there, other explanations might apply. One, it could be conformist bias, right? Now that you're immersed in this system, so sure, you know what the norms are in general, but now that you're actually, in this family, and especially in the highly patriarchal families where, you aren't just marrying a husband, you're, marrying an entire family that is now regulating your behavior. So you're exposed to sort of the reality of that in a different way. That can be conformist bias. And then, an alternative is that people are making the best of a bad situation, right? Whether you want to, psychologize that and call that Stockholm syndrome, or that people are just sort of rational actors and they're saying, well, okay, right, I have lost a lot of my autonomy in this, arrangement. I can fight it, or I can, join the team, basically. And so, even though they're subordinate within the family, they're embracing the position just because it's better than chafing at a very strongly held norm of all those around them who have more power.
Yeah. So wait, let me respond to something you said earlier on first, where you mentioned like the age interaction with marriage. So, you should correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think my models did account for this because they did stratify the results by age. Age was one of the variables in the model. So I think I did take that into account. But I definitely think you're right in suggesting that like the possibility of women who are in marital relationships counting their losses and saying, well, apparently in my current situation, this is the best thing to do. I definitely think that is a possibility, and that's one of the things, this like acquiescence to the common norm because you have no other option is one of the major things that I actually hope to study more ethnographically as well, but that I wasn't able to do as much as I hoped. But I think it's a fair point to say that maybe I should be more open to that possibility when presenting the work that I did.
Okay, just in terms of the age issue, as you already know, not everyone here does, I'm a total idiot when it comes to stats, so I have nothing to say about the quality of your methods. It looks very impressive, but I'm not in a position to really evaluate it. But having age in the model isn't the same as saying I'm examining the age at which it's likely that some individuals will have just married other individuals will have not yet been, right? Because when you're having age in the model, you're treating it across the range of ages. You aren't looking at that particular inflection point. Am I wrong about that? Or?
I mean, I think what I did was like practically stratifying the sample by age, although age, of course, is a continuous variable in my model, and looking at like, well, if you look at women of a particular age, how much, given that they're all the same age, how much does being married matter for them? So comparing women of the same age who are either married or not married.
Okay. I mean, in a society in which almost everyone marries eventually, then that's going to wash out at the later ages. But I'll have to think about it more as to whether that method is homing in on that particular point in time that I'm most interested in. But
Yeah.
like I said, you can explain to me later.
I'd love to talk about it more, and yeah, thank you for asking your question. I'm sorry you're not able to be here today, but I'm glad to see you over Zoom. Any other questions from the room? Brian?
Hi, Renee. I just want to say that it's just fantastic to see you presenting all these results, and I know especially all the challenges that you faced during the pandemic to have put together such a polished talk and interesting topics of research is just fantastic. So I want to just give you all the credit that you deserve. I being somebody who has an interest in like spatial dimensions to behavior, I was looking at your first study and interested in the model in theory that you were developing about interaction frequency between your research participants and outgroup members. And I know that wasn't your variable of focus interest as much as the others, and you have constraints obviously in the format of this kind of talk, but I was wondering if you could discuss a bit what seems to me to be a pretty challenging, like at face value, it seems to be a pretty simple thing that you could say, oh, folks who spend more time interacting with people outside of their group, whatever that group boundary, however it's operationalized, might be more likely to be either randomly copying from others outside their group or considering outgroup members as a part of the prestigious reference category that they're thinking when they're making these prestige biased decisions, or even just even in a conformist model, it could be that if you spend more time around outgroup members, those outgroup members can be swamping out the signal of what conformity represents. So, if I'm not mistaken, the interaction model had second best level of predictive accuracy compared to the model that had the social learning biases built in. But I didn't see the interaction effect or the interaction measures in the model that had the prestige-based learning or other predictive variables. And recognizing the complexity of how these things can co-vary, and I just thought I'd ask, you mentioned not having, well, you didn't have much to say about the interaction with outsiders, but you said you had multiple measures of interaction. And I was just wondering, did any of those measures of interaction pop out as being more predictive than others in terms of the frequency, the likelihood of choosing outgroup norms, or is there anything that you could say about that measure, and how could we incorporate it into models of cultural evolutionary?
Sure, yeah. So Brian, I guess summarizing it very briefly, is asking about the interaction effect model and the different variables that we looked for, and basically asking you to give some more information about what we found there. So, so we looked at how close women live to the urban center of a pool, where they are more exposed to both people who are more out-group assimilating, as I called it. So people who maybe don't live like this agro-pastoralist way of life, but have a job, perhaps selling things on a market or other types of jobs in a main town, where they're also more close to the hospital. We looked at how often people have been to that town in the last 6 months, and how often people have been to the hospital, how often people have been to the hospital, we looked at that separately because it kind of interacts with, like, if you practice some of these norms, you have to go to the hospital for that. And then we also had a measure for education, how many years of education people have had, education can take place both in the town, so some children move to a boarding school in the town if they are not living close to there already to receive education, but there's also schools in the more rural areas around it. And none of these, if you looked at that model specifically, none of these had a like detectable effect on outgroup norm adoption.
Just curious, does language play a factor in here in terms of either signifying a kind of openness or an investment into outgroup interaction, or is a linguistic barrier not salient in this context? Is that correct?
That's actually an interesting question that I can only partly answer. So Himba, their language is called Ochi Hiriro, which is also what the majority group in this area speaks. So I think people wouldn't have to switch their language to be able to interact with that group. Any other questions?